All right, Anna, thank you for joining DAO Talk. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so excited to have you here. Why don't you get us started? Would love to hear more about your background, how you got into crypto, and what you're working on now.
Sure, yeah. Awesome to be here. This is my first big podcast, so I'm really honored to have
I'm
be
glad
here.
you think it's a big podcast. That's perfect. Don't worry. Like I said,
future big podcast.
our audience is used to me and Tommy, who's our other marketing person at Tally, and so you're guaranteed to be an upgrade. Don't worry about it.
Perfect. I love that. Yeah, my background. So I kind of feel like I think a lot of us are, but I'm a professional at making things up as I go along.
Perfect. You're in good company. Me too.
Yeah, same, right? So I feel like I've always had my own path that I wanted to create. In high school, I have this really vivid memory that I tell about often now because I think it's relevant and I think a lot of people really relate. I was at this job fair and everyone had to put Post-its on a board for what do you want to do when you grow up? And I remember writing that the job that I will have does not exist yet.
Wow.
And then I spend the next...
That is extremely deep.
Yeah,
nice.
Right? and I don't think it's because I was particularly prophetic. I think it was just because I was interested in so many things. And because I saw technology creating interesting opportunities, interesting job opportunities. And at the time, this was more so Web2 companies. So I saw the rise of social media platforms. I saw YouTube. I saw Instagram just recently launched. And I was wow, this is going to create jobs that just don't exist. And of course, later we have social media managers and we have influencers and all of this. This was not a job when I was in high school yet. But I knew that there was something there and I knew that I wanted to be part of it in some way, shape or form. And I knew that I wanted my job to include tech. I knew that I wanted it to include being around people. I knew that I wanted to be something that didn't exist yet. And so I kind of spent the next decade proving that right. When I went to college, I created my own major. It was around marketing and communications, but I really just wanted to take a lot of classes that were offered that didn't fit into a traditional major and just make up my own thing. And then I kind of fell into freelancing afterwards because I was well, I feel like what I'm good at is connecting dots. I feel like I'm good at problem solving in creative ways. So why don't I just try to do things on my own and see where that leads me? And it led me to being able to live in a lot of different places, to travel. And there's a big overlap between people who travel and work remotely and crypto.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that.
That's definitely true.
Right? And it's obvious now, but it wasn't so obvious at the time because this was still 2016, 2017. And I just started going to meetups. And I was what is this crypto thing? Before we called it crypto, we didn't call it Web3 yet.
Yeah.
So,
that's right. Pre Web3.
Pretty Web3, yeah.
I think there are some small parts of the industry calling it Web3, but yeah, not a lot of people.
Yeah. So that's how I fell into just learning about what crypto was. I started going to meetups, learning more, and I still didn't work full time in anything. I was still doing a lot of marketing and freelancing work. And then the pandemic hit. And so I went back to the States. I stopped traveling like all of us. And I was kind of thinking, what do I want to do with my time now that I have a lot of time? And I started diving deeper down the crypto rabbit hole. And I started participating in communities. And the one community that I was so fortunate to fall into was Maker.
Cool.
Maker was the best.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great place to start in the industry. I feel like I have met a bunch of people who got their start at Maker who are doing big things now.
Yeah. I I didn't realize, but what we were doing at Maker was absolutely revolutionary in terms of community-driven participation. And of course, the whole move to the DAO now. Yeah, Maker was just such a lucky entry point for me. And I met incredible people that have guided me through my journey. And then I subsequently ended up working for the Maker Foundation as we were decentralizing onto the DAO. And then it's all history from there.
Awesome. That's great. That's a great story. I'm sure you did some great work at the Maker Foundation. And I think now you're at Celo, right? So how did you make that transition?
Yeah. At Maker, I just participated as a community contributor. And I'm going to be on the panel at DAO NYC talking about the future of work is crypto payroll. Cool. And I don't know if that's necessarily a future of work for everyone. I think it's part of the future of work. But I was working for kind of the DAO before it was fully DAO, before the foundation has left. And then I got hired to work for the foundation to kind of bootstrap this move from foundation to the DAO. And the way that we did that was by incubating these core units that then later became teams on the DAO. And so when the foundation went away and fully started moving towards these core units, I kind of had an opportunity to either work for a core unit or like start my own core unit or join a different core unit and continue working fully for the DAO. So it's kind of like this full circle move back,
that
community,
makes sense.
foundation,
That's cool.
DAO. But then at the same time, I kind of had an opportunity to reassess because I've already been there for a little while. I had the opportunity to think about what do I want to learn. And Celo was looking for a very similar role for programs, community programs.
Cool.
And I just felt like it was a really great opportunity to learn something different, working for something like Maker, which is a protocol, versus working for a layer one. There's so many different, it's just a different ballgame. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think it was a learning opportunity that really drew me, and the team. Like there's an incredible, such kind, smart people working at the Celo Foundation. So yeah,
Awesome.
I was really lucky
to
end up there.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's such a strong, like getting your start at Maker and watching the sort of like decentralization process, like that's such a foundational experience. I'm kind of jealous because like to this day Maker is really like one of the, it's like the most solid example of decentralization at the protocol level that we actually have in the space. So that's super cool. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about Celo though. So like tell me more about Celo, the blockchain, the team, the foundation, and what you're working on there.
Yeah, sure. So Celo is a layer one protocol, is a layer one blockchain. It's a fork of Ethereum, so it's EVM compatible. And what I came to do at Celo was ecosystem growth. That's kind of the overall team that I sit within. But in ecosystem growth, we have a lot of verticals. Community is one of them. And I think community is the most important part to growing any ecosystem, but especially to something like Celo, our community is really, there's so many segments of community. There's our communities, our founders, people who are creating different applications on top of Celo. It's people who are looking to be just advocates for the Celo ecosystem. It's people who are using some of these products of Celo. And it's also people who are looking for novel use cases. I think that's a really big part that drew me to Celo, is like Celo is working on how do you use this in real life? Like what can it be useful for? So we do a lot of pilots where they kind of like test use cases and they have a hypothesis. We have a whole team working on that. And that's really cool. But yeah, I mean, I mostly work on community programs, which is just getting people involved, getting people excited.
Yeah. I feel like community is actually a great example of what you were talking about earlier, like a job that didn't exist, until recently. And I feel like also people don't really understand what it is who don't work in the space, like community. What does that mean? Right. And it's also something that like in Web3, it like overlaps with different other functions like customer experience or marketing. So like, tell me, what does community mean to you? And like, what do you kind of do with that at Celo?
Yeah, you're so on point. I think community sits, personally, I think at the intersection of like marketing, DevRel, BD. It's all of these things together. And so it's really easy to like lump it with something else. Like a lot of people will think community and jump to like end users. Like end users are our community, but the way that you grow end users is like maybe more of like a marketing function or maybe more like some kind of other like partnerships function. But for me, community is more about what actions are these people taking. It's not just consumers of your product. Like to me, that's an old way we used to think about community, where in the Web 2 world, where your community is your audience and they're probably consumers. Like they're probably consuming your content or they're consuming your product. And so building for a community used to mean people who are going to consume something that you have. Whereas in Web3 and how I think about community, it's more about taking action. So it's like, what is your community doing in your community? Is like, what kinds of things are they like? Are they building something? Are they participating? Like, I think the thing that I love about this work is that people have an opportunity to create their own path to like do something interesting and to apply their skills in a unique way. So I think that's how I approach community. It's more about action than just like passively consuming something.
Yeah, that's super cool. Like my background is in B2B software. And we talk about like the customer, right? And I feel like the customer is not really the right word oftentimes in crypto and Web3. It's like you said, we really want them to like take like an active role, right? Like kind of like that blurred line between like what the team is versus the community versus people who are building on Celo. Everyone's kind of bringing something to the table and really helping build up the ecosystem versus like this sort of linear relationship of like company to customer.
And also it's different. Community is going to mean something different for something like Layer 1 versus something like Maker versus something like a purely social community. Like I'm a big part of Meta Gamma Delta. That was like my first social DAO. I mean, we're a grants giving DAO.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That gives grants to women-built projects. But it's what community means there is totally different than it means for Celo, than it means for Maker.
Right.
In Maker, a huge part of community is like important voting decisions. Like voting is done by community. So like educating Maker voters on how do you govern the protocol, like that's a big function that community team originally bootstrapped. It was like a lot of voter education, which I think is super cool and like very different.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
This idea of like, in Web2, right? You're not going to be educating your users on governance, like they don't need to be involved in like board decisions, and they aren't going to be, right? So yeah, I think that's really cool. Like I didn't even think of that, like builder, user, owner, basically. Like there's so many different roles. Yeah,
that's the key differentiator. I think it's a way, how do you own the ecosystem in a way, because your community is a stakeholder. Your community has some kind of ownership in whatever you're building, which is really amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned it's kind of different, like working for a protocol like Maker versus a layer 1 blockchain like Celo. Talk to me about that. Like what do you see as like the difference, maybe from like a community perspective, a growth perspective, working on those two very different projects?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting. Recently, I kind of drew this parallel. Like, so Celo, one of the products of Celo is stablecoins. And we have a stablecoin mechanism called Mento that is the way that you generate stablecoins on the Celo blockchain. And what's interesting is like Maker to Ethereum is what Mento is to Celo. But right now, Mento is still part.
That makes sense.
Right? It's like the Maker protocol is to Ethereum because it's a way to generate stablecoins. As Mento is to Celo. But at Celo, it's a much younger ecosystem. It's a much smaller ecosystem. It has very different applications. And so Mento is still within kind of like the Celo ecosystem. It's still kind of incubated by that. Whereas Maker was never like, it's like not, the relationship is just not the same. So I think working at Maker, it was like very much its own like individual entity. Whereas working at Celo, so I work at the Celo Foundation, and there's also multiple entities. There's C Labs, who originally like bootstrap protocol development, and now Celo Foundation is in charge of like whole ecosystem growth. So there's all of these pieces are still kind of under the same umbrella. And so you have so many more stakeholders and so many more community segments. And then there's also like validators who secure the network. Like that's also technically part of your community, right? That you have to think about. And then there's like people who participate in governance.
Community role. It's like providing security for the project. Talk about a job that didn't exist 10 years ago.
Seriously.
Like, I'm a blockchain validator. Like, what? That's really cool. That's cool. Okay, so that's interesting. So in that context, like where you have multiple different, like basically legal entities that help bootstrap the project, you have validators, you have application developers, like what does decentralization look like? Because like you kind of saw that play out at Maker. So just curious, like what do you think about kind of like, what does decentralization mean to you in the context of Celo, and like what do you think the future looks like there?
I think a lot about this, because in my role in community, like a huge part is how do you give more power to your community? Like I constantly think about that. And that's actually something I'm excited to spend more time exploring in my role, is like how do we create a path to gradual decentralization? And also, what does that mean? And also, being at Maker, I understood that there's like different reasons to decentralize that aren't the same for everyone. Like not necessarily everyone needs to decentralize. But at Celo, I do think it's really important. And in general, I think recently became really clear that we need to kind of like unbundle the foundation a little bit into more smaller units that can just have agency and autonomy to execute on things quickly. And so that's just like on a team level side. I do think foundations in general and like larger companies, because we got to a point where like we're a very large company now as a foundation. And I think they can benefit from having smaller action-oriented kind of like pods, which is how we work. We have circles because we're a teal organization. But I think there's even more that can be taken even further in terms of like what Maker has, which is core units. But then there's also another piece of decentralization. There's like decentralized funding. Whereas at the foundation, like our funding comes, we have a treasury, but we also have an on-chain fund at the Celo at the protocol level that like protocol revenue goes into. And I think one piece of decentralization for Celo is going to be about people applying for on-chain funding and then having their own teams that are like tangential to foundation team, because I don't think there has to be just one ecosystem team working on ecosystem growth. Like, and we've seen it. We have several funds that are on-chain funds that got revenue from the protocol that are now doing things on their own. And I think it's amazing. And like, I'm really bullish on more teams doing that. Like, I'm really bullish on regional DAOs, like people who used to work or like who do work for the foundation, who are bootstrapping regional ecosystems, being able to apply for on-chain funding and then just like run with it, you know, like unbundle the foundation in some ways, like be able to execute because they know best, you know, like we don't know best sitting from in a global role, even as a community. Like I kind of do a lot of like global community programming, but someone who is an eco lead in Brazil, like they know much better what their community needs. And if they have budget and they have autonomy to execute, they can just go with it. And like, I love that. I think that's the future.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think people get stuck on like a particular version of decentralization, or they're like, oh, decentralization, that means you need to have like a DAO with on-chain governance, or you need to have an anonymous founder who's no longer involved, like Bitcoin. Like there's all these manifestations of decentralization, and people get attached to like a particular manifestation of it, when in reality, I think decentralization can take many different forms, right?
Yeah.
I think you can have a traditional company, but have the product be very decentralized. Like Uniswap is a great example of this. You have Uniswap Labs, which is like the tech startup, basically a traditional tech startup, very centralized. But then you have Uniswap, the protocol, which is extremely decentralized, right? Like it's not upgradable, like it can't really be taken down. They have multiple front ends. Like there's, you know, it's the product itself is extremely decentralized, right? In the context of like Celo or layer one blockchain, it's like, okay, do we have a broad set of validators? Like, is it permissionless, right? Is it permissionless to build? Like there's so many different ways that things can be sort of like, you can kind of like spread out that power and make it permissionless for others to get involved and make the protocol more robust.
Exactly. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head, I think. Yeah. And there's so many layers. There's like decentralized funding, there's decentralized process, there's decentralized like security. Like this is really important for layer one. That wasn't necessarily as important for something like Maker. There was like other pieces that were more important, like people knowing how to change parameters and like making decisions on that level of protocol. Whereas at Celo, it's like, it's security that's at stake.
Right. Yeah. You shift from that governance over like risk sort of thing versus like, blockchain security. Yeah. Requires a totally different approach. That's awesome. Well, hey, like, great talking Celo with you. I actually haven't used the protocol before, so I need to jump in, but it was great to get like a good introduction from you. Actually, that's a good question. Like, what's the best way for me to what's like an app I should use, or like how should I like tap into Celo?
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of natively built apps on Celo, and then there's a lot of protocols that have deployed on Celo that you would know and love and use, that are like blue chip projects that have deployed on Celo. But I think maybe the more interesting way to plug into Celo is this. We have this, one of the reasons that I think people build on Celo is for the refi aspect of it, and people who want to build in regenerative finance space. And I think like-minded founders want to build with like-minded founders. So we are seeing a lot of people in that community start to participate. In terms of use cases, I don't know what is the best project for you to try to use, but I think just learning about like what's happening with Climate Collective would be really cool. If you're interested at all in like people who are building in carbon credits on chain, like a lot of projects are in that space. And I think that's a really interesting point to like start learning about Celo, because I think a lot of projects are going to be launching in that space. And we're actively, we have an entity called Climate Collective who does have a proposal, and I believe it, as of now, has passed to get on-chain funding. Yeah, so they're going to be basically...
So they're applying to that on-chain funding you were talking about earlier.
Exactly. So they're going to have their own budget, and they're going to be incubating climate startups in the space.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely think refi, refi is definitely something that interests me, and I feel like, there's like a neat ecosystem of people that are thinking about like how are we redirecting like economies and finance to fund public goods and like create like sustainable public resources. That's cool that there's like a focus there on Celo. Is that something that Celo, like the organization, kind of like is that like a shared value set, or how did that start happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been a shared value from the very beginning that we launched Mainnet on Earth Day.
Nice.
So
Love
that
it.
was very much so the intention. And it is a carbon negative blockchain, but also there's just a big focus on investing in founders in the ecosystem who are building in this space.
Cool.
And I think it's just something that all of us really personally care about. So I think it's felt through the work that we do, because I think a lot of the people that Celo has attracted really care about that personally.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for diving into all that with me. I want to get your thoughts, maybe just stepping away from like the specific projects you've worked on, just thinking about crypto more broadly. I have like a 2-part question for you. So the first one is, what do you like most about working in Web3? Like, it can be hard sometimes. It's a bear market right now. Like what keeps you like waking up excited to go? And then the second part is like, what's one thing you would change? So like, what's something that you think needs to be improved in the industry or frustrates you that you hope you can work on going forward?
Oh, okay. I'm going to start with what I would change, or like what slightly frustrates me, because it relates to what we were talking earlier about community versus audience.
Yeah.
I think it frustrates me a little bit that we don't have or a lot of people who come from more like Web2 traditional backgrounds, when they think about community or ecosystem growth, they're like, how do we put people into a CRM? And it's just like, it's really tough. And I'm not knocking that down, because it's important, right? Like, it's important to understand like who's in your community, and it's important to understand. But I think it's really challenging sometimes to think through, like, how do you fundamentally just have different ways of thinking about that in Web3, and how do you bring some of those like ideas and practices that can be useful, but then also don't just turn into like putting people into a pipeline. I think that's what's a little bit difficult for me on a personal level, because I work with so many people in ecosystem growth and in partnerships, and it's obviously like really important for us to get our work done. But like, what is a crypto CRM? Like, what? I have no idea.
That's a really interesting point. I have like a Web2 growth marketing background, and as I was thinking about transitioning into working in Web3 full time, I was like, okay, well, what I've done in the past is primarily like digital advertising and CRM. It's like, that's not actually, especially like I work in the DAO space, super small, like it's just a very organic kind of space right now. It's like, well, we're not going to do Facebook ads, and like, I'm not going to ask people for their email very often, and definitely not to like use the product. So like, got to figure out some new tactics. So yeah, like definitely hear you on that one. One thing that I think just personally is like refreshing and like, important in the space is like organic content. It's also new, right? And there's so many things left to figure out that I think there's like definitely value to. Thought leadership is also not a word that I would use in Web3, but like to helping people understand like what the problem spaces are and what are the like current state of best practice or experiences people have for solving them, because there's just like such a strong need for that kind of stuff. Whereas like, in my past life in Web2 is like there was already 10,000 content pieces about like any given specific subject. So that's one area I think like that can play a big role for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, if someone solves this, because BD and partnerships and just ecosystem people do need some kind of way to track their ecosystem. But yeah, I don't think necessarily collecting emails or like having that kind of data, I don't know if that's the way, but if someone figures it out.
So what about what you love? Like what excites you most about working in the space?
I've been talking a lot about this recently, and I like to think about it as like, we talk a lot about onboarding, but what are we onboarding people into? And I think it's about self-determination, not in some like existential way, but in a self-determination in a way that you can determine the kind of work that you do, the people that you work with. It's a lot of Web3 gave us tools to create our own path. And I think for a person who's always been really interested in creating my own path, it can be really lonely to walk your own path. But in the space, there's so many people doing the exact same thing. It's like, that's what I think gets me out of bed every morning and gets me so excited to keep building. And it doesn't matter what market it is. I think that's relevant in every time, right? And I think that's the best part about crypto.
That's a really interesting point. Like I also am kind of here for the adventure, but there's like friends to have the adventure with, like who have a similar mindset.
Exactly.
I love that. It's a great answer. Well, thanks so much for joining, and it was great getting to know you a little bit. I hope you have an awesome rest of your week here in New York. Looking forward to your panel at DAO NYC.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.